A girl lost her parents to war at a young age. One day, by chance, she was found by an officer. From that moment on, she was trained as a killing machine. She had no sense of self. She didn't even have a name, until one day, Colonel Diet Fried, who had taken her in, sent her to his brother. She met Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert. Gilbert seemed different from everyone else she had encountered. When he saw her in such a pitiful state, he gave her the first warm hug of her life. He then took her to his home. The servants prepared to bathe and clothe her, but the girl, whose life had only known killing, was filled with hostility toward everyone around her. In the end, with Gilbert's help, the servants were able to bathe her. That night, Gilbert went to check on the girl. He was shocked to find that she was sleeping on the floor. Her icy blue eyes held no emotion whatsoever. Her experiences growing up had left her mind filled only with thoughts of violence. Looking at the girl curled up in the corner, Gilbert's heart began to ache. Perhaps he was the only one who would see this girl, who only knew how to kill, as a real person to protect. But that day, Gilbert's superior gave him orders to take the girl to the battlefield. Her mission was to kill the enemy on the battlefield. Gilbert couldn't defy the order. He had no choice but to bring her to the front lines. However, before each battle, Gilbert would always tell her to stay put and wait. What Gilbert didn't know was that the kindness he showed her, she quietly kept in her heart. She had long since made Gilbert her whole world. So, the girl secretly followed Gilbert as he carried out his mission. At Gilbert's command, the girl was the first to rush into the fray. Years of brutal training made it easy for her to eliminate all the enemies in her path. Though she had killed many, her icy blue eyes showed no sign of emotion. Watching her, Gilbert was overwhelmed with indescribable feelings. How much suffering had this girl endured to become so cold-hearted? After that mission, Gilbert gave her the name Violet. The meaning of Violet's name is love and eternal beauty. It was Gilbert's most sincere blessing for her. From that moment on, Violet etched Gilbert into her heart forever. She silently vowed to always be Gilbert's killing tool. With Violet's help, the army Gilbert commanded was unstoppable. They liberated one region after another. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Gilbert took Violet to the local market. He told Violet that she could ask for anything. Violet thought this was a command from Gilbert, but Gilbert gently told her that it was a gift he wanted to give her. Then, Gilbert took Violet and began selecting things she liked. They searched for a long time. Finally, Violet stopped in front of a stall. She told Gilbert that she had seen his eyes. When Gilbert went closer, he realized it was a brooch with an emerald gem. Its color matched his eyes exactly. For some reason, after seeing the green gem, Violet felt a flutter in her heart, something she had never experienced before. She didn't know what that feeling was. She couldn't express it either. Without hesitation, Gilbert bought the brooch. He wanted to know why Violet had chosen the green gem, but Violet simply told him it was because the color reminded her of Gilbert's eyes. It was the most beautiful color she had ever seen. Gilbert fell silent at Violet's words. He didn't say anything. He simply took the brooch and gently pinned it on her. Emerald symbolizes luck, happiness, and the love that Gilbert had never been able to say. Violet thanked him several times, but Gilbert never responded. In the end, he couldn't say the words "I love you," but war is always cruel. During the final assault, Gilbert and Violet fell into an enemy ambush. After a grueling battle, they finally awaited reinforcements, but just as Gilbert let his guard down, a bullet suddenly shot toward his head. Violet quickly reached Gilbert's side, but another bullet from the enemy hit Gilbert again. Violet swiftly grabbed her gun and shot one of the enemies. Gilbert, at this point, told Violet to run, but Violet insisted on taking Gilbert with her. She struggled to lift Gilbert. Then, an enemy shot hit Violet's arm from a distance. Gilbert quickly reacted and killed the enemy, but at that moment, the enemy threw a grenade. The massive explosion echoed through the sky, and as the smoke cleared, Violet lost both of her hands. Gilbert lay prostrate on the ground, but Violet did not give up. She sank her teeth into Gilbert's clothing. Even if she had to crawl, she would take Gilbert away. Gilbert's heart ached deeply. He stopped Violet's actions and told her to survive no matter what. This was the last command he gave to Violet. Finally, Gilbert managed to say the words, "I love you," but Violet didn't understand what love was. At that moment, all she wanted was to escape with Gilbert, but then another explosion occurred. When Violet woke up again, she found herself in a hospital bed. Her hands had been replaced with mechanical limbs. Violet, however, didn't care about that. She slowly grasped a pen with her unfamiliar mechanical hands and began to write a letter to Gilbert, but none of her letters ever received a response. Violet vaguely guessed that Gilbert had already died, but she still held onto a glimmer of hope, waiting for the day she would reunite with Gilbert. A few days later, Gilbert's comrade, Hodgins, arrived at the hospital to take Violet. According to Hodgins, he was entrusted by Gilbert to bring Violet with him. Upon hearing this news, Violet was overjoyed. She thought she would finally reunite with Gilbert, the one she had always longed for. Without hesitation, she followed Hodgins. However, Hodgins did not take Violet to see Gilbert. Instead, he brought her to a house. A kind-hearted elderly woman was willing to adopt Violet. When the elderly woman inadvertently saw Violet's steel mechanical hands, she couldn't help but feel pity for the girl. She then took out a pair of gloves from her youth and gave them to Violet as a gift. But in the face of the woman's kindness, Violet remained indifferent. She didn't want to be adopted by anyone. She only wanted to return to Gilbert's side. So, when Hodgins left, Violet chased after him. She questioned Hodgins, asking why Gilbert had abandoned her. Had she become useless to him because she lost her hands and couldn't be a weapon of war anymore? Violet expressed that, even with her mechanical hands, if she trained, she could still fight. But Hodgins told her that the war was over. Upon hearing this news, Violet suddenly fell silent. As a tool of war, if she was no longer needed by the military, she felt she might as well die. Hodgins knew that it would be difficult for Violet to live here, so he took her to his company. It was a place where letters were written for people. During the war, many people couldn't write or read, so a service to help write and send letters had been established. Since that day, Violet became a postwoman. Compared to the horrors of war, this job was incredibly simple for her. So, Violet began working tirelessly, day and night. She didn't even take a break from morning until evening. One evening, after work, Hodgins was sitting on a tram when he noticed a postwoman delivering letters. He couldn't help but marvel at which company worked so hard, even in the middle of the night. But when he looked closer, he realized it was Violet. Hodgins quickly ordered her to take a break, and then took her to a restaurant to eat. But Violet had truly come to think of herself as a tool of war. Unless given an order, she wouldn't do anything. Even something as simple as eating, she would only do after being given permission. After their meal, Hodgins asked Violet a question. "What was Gilbert's last command to you?" Violet, with a look of sorrow, replied that Gilbert's final command was for her to gain her freedom and live a good life. As for the last sentence, Violet did not say it, because it was that Gilbert loved her. But even now, Violet didn't understand what love was. She often asked Hodgins where Gilbert was, but Hodgins didn't know whether Gilbert was alive or dead. He told Violet that before the final battle, Gilbert had found him, and said that if anything happened to him in the war, he entrusted Hodgins to take care of Violet. But Violet refused to believe that Gilbert was gone. She kept hoping for the day they would meet again. Years passed by, and Violet continued working day and night. At the same time, she never stopped searching for any trace of Gilbert. But on this day, Hodgins' company received a letter that had been returned. When Hodgins discovered the letter, he was surprised to find that the handwriting on the envelope was Gilbert's. To confirm his thoughts, he even took the letter to Gilbert's brother, Diet Fried. After reading the letter, Diet Fried also believed it was Gilbert's handwriting. Back at the company, Hodgins immediately told Violet the news. He said he was going to the address on the letter to confirm the identity of the sender. Upon hearing that Gilbert might still be alive, Violet was overwhelmed with excitement. Her heart raced, and she spent the entire night sitting alone on the rooftop, unable to calm down. The next morning, Hodgins and Violet set out, but as they traveled, Violet, who had been so excited at first, began to feel uneasy. She didn't know if, after so many years, Gilbert would still recognize her, and if she did see Gilbert, what would she say? Should she tell him everything she had done over the years? Filled with anxious thoughts, Violet finally arrived at the destination. They arrived at the outside of a yard. Hodgins told Violet to wait outside, while he went in to confirm the identity of the person inside. Not long after Hodgins left, a group of children approached Violet. From them, Violet learned that the man had a disabled right arm and right eye, which matched the injuries that Gilbert had suffered. So, she confirmed that the man was indeed Gilbert. She continuously asked the children about Gilbert, desperately wanting to know every detail of his life here. Meanwhile, Hodgins arrived at Gilbert's doorstep. With nervous anticipation, he knocked on the door. Then, a voice that Hodgins recognized so well came from inside. After calming his emotions, Hodgins stepped in. He could hardly believe that the man living in seclusion here was truly Gilbert. After the war ended, Gilbert, severely injured and unconscious, had been sent to a hospital in a convent due to a lack of military identification. Once he was discharged, weary of war, he didn't return to his homeland. Instead, he chose a life of wandering. About a year ago, he arrived at this small island. Perhaps charmed by the simplicity of life here, he decided to stay and became a teacher. He had chosen to live in anonymity because he believed he had ruined Violet's life. In his heart, he thought that the innocent Violet deserved to live a happier life, one filled with more love and care. Instead, he had led her into the brutal battlefield, and had left her without her hands in the war. He couldn't forgive himself for that. He then told Hodgins that he couldn't meet Violet. He believed that if he wasn't by her side, perhaps she would have a better life. When Violet saw Hodgins coming out, she immediately ran toward him. She had confirmed from the children that the man was indeed Gilbert. And now, all she could think about was meeting him immediately. However, Hodgins regretfully told her that Gilbert didn't want to see her. Violet stood there, frozen. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Her mind went blank. She had waited so long for this moment, for the day she could finally see Gilbert. Ignoring Hodgins' attempts to stop her, Violet charged into the yard. But when she entered the house, Gilbert was no longer there. That night, the rain poured down heavily. Lost and disheartened, Violet found herself once again standing outside Gilbert's door. She cried, calling out his name. The rain and her tears mingled together. Gilbert stood inside, motionless, too afraid to open the door or respond. He just stood there, not moving, hearing Violet's repeated declarations of longing for him. In that moment, Violet finally understood what love truly was. Gilbert heard everything she said, but didn't respond. Maybe he didn't know how to respond. Finally, Gilbert spoke, but his voice was devoid of emotion. He simply told Violet to leave, that he didn't want to see her. The rain kept falling harder. Desperate, Violet turned away and started to run. She ran and cried, but perhaps she was too exhausted. As she eventually collapsed to her knees, she didn't understand why Gilbert was treating her like this. What she didn't know, however, was that Gilbert's heart was also torn apart by pain. In her despair, Violet decided to leave. She cried as she told Hodgins that, at least this time, she hadn't come in vain. She had heard his voice. That was enough for her. She was just happy to know that he was still alive. Violet was leaving, even though she was reluctant, but she knew she had no reason to stay. If this was the life Gilbert wanted, then she had to leave. Before leaving, Violet wrote a letter. She asked a child to deliver the letter to Gilbert. When Gilbert opened the letter, his heart could no longer remain calm.
親愛なるギルベルト少佐、突然お邪魔したことをお許しください。これが少佐に宛てて書く最後の手紙です。私が今生きて誰かを思えるようになったのはあなたのおかげです。私を受け入れてくださってありがとうございました。本を読んでくださったり、文字やいろいろなことを教えてくださってありがとうございました。ブローチを買ってくださってありがとうございました。いつもそばに置いてくださってありがとうございました。愛してるをありがとうございました。
After reading the letter, he could no longer suppress the overwhelming love he felt inside. In a frenzy, he ran toward the port. However, the ship that Violet had boarded had already set sail, but Gilbert didn't give up. He ran without stopping. Using all his strength, he desperately shouted the name that had been etched in his heart. Violet! At that moment, Violet, too, had jumped off the ship in a frenzy. Their distance grew smaller with every passing second. Finally, they reached each other, and in that moment, they embraced.